Welcome back to Daytime Ottawa here on Rogers TV. You'll recognize my next guest because he put out his first book about music here in the Ottawa region. It was called Rockin on the Rideau, Ottawa's Golden Age of Rock and Roll, and he has followed that up with a new book called Rockin on the Rideau to the 70s. I'm joined by author Jim Hurcomb. Jim, welcome to the show, and let's talk about a great success in the first book. Why did you decide to continue on and write this next book?
Well, being a great success, that was kind of helpful. But just the story wasn't finished yet. And the feedback I got from people was, I love the book, but are you going to do something on the 70s? And it didn't take much convincing because I still had a lot of contacts through that time. And it was a really exciting year when it came to not only music, but also radio and shows and film and everything. And the 70s is basically my ballpark. That's my
Right.
decade. So it didn't take much convincing, and it was a great ride.
Tell me about the 70s. What was it like in the 70s when it came to music here in the Ottawa region?
Oh, it was so eclectic. I think the first book was told more from the musician's standpoint and from the standpoint of the bands, how they got together. But the second book to me was more for fans and reminiscing about the places we go to see shows, the concerts that came through town, the movies, the clubs, and of course the bands, the radio stations we listened to, and much more. Um, it was harder to get a handle on a specific angle to take. That's why I sort of looked at it from that perspective. And we had great bands like the five-man electrical band, who we finished off Volume 1 with, start up in Volume 2 when their song Signs became the big hit of the summer of 1972. And what happened to that band? And new groups that came along like Octavian, Heaven's Radio, Red Hot, Avalon, and so many others. And the great concerts. It wouldn't be the 70s without bands like Led Zeppelin, the Eagles, Queen, Supertramp, Alice Cooper, David Bowie coming to town. And we relived many of those great concerts as well, the stories behind the scenes, and what made those particular nights so memorable. And then, of course, going out to the clubs, there's a chapter we call Highway to Hell. No, Highway to Hull.
Highway
And
to
it's
Hull, I
about
love it.
Highway to Hull, about kids going over to places like the Chaudière, the Ottawa House,
Yeah,
and the British Hotel in Aylmer, and so many other great spots. And Jerry Barber, the famous bouncer, of course, at the Chaudière. And the bands that really made a living playing in those clubs up and down the Ottawa River made a very good living as well. And on the Ottawa side, we visit Barrymore's, the birth of that club in 1978, 1979, after it was a disco for a brief time. So
right.
many memories and so many things to choose from. And it all really rolled together quite nicely because it was a time when the fans really, it was an era that can never be repeated because it's for the music fans. Everything you could possibly want was there, even a chapter on the record stores that we go to on a weekly basis
Oh,
to leaf through the new
absolutely.
vinyl.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
You
mean,
remember those
we're
days.
we're 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 fortunate that we still have a couple of wonderful record stores. I mean, but they were everywhere. Like Sam the Record Man. I mean, that's the place I remember going to and buying my first album there. And I'd be remiss, if you mentioned the five man electrical band. Unfortunately, we lost Les Emerson,
Yes.
recently, which was certainly a sad loss. Somebody that was still making music and playing music here in this community. But let's go back to the 70s for a moment. Was there a story that kind of stood out to you, Jim, that highlighted what the 70s were really like musically here in the city?
Wow. I mean, the story of the song Signs is timeless.
Yeah.
Speaking of Les Emerson, of course, he wrote that song as he was traveling back and forth with the band from Los Angeles, where they relocated, and back to Ottawa to make money. Basically, they make money in Ottawa, playing high schools and bars, and they drive back to Los Angeles and record new demos, shop them around. And not that they weren't having that much luck at the time, but on one of those long trips back to Los Angeles, they were driving through Arizona, and Les was looking out the window and he saw these beautiful mesas and mountains that were, they're from Millennium and so famous from cowboy movies like the John Wayne films. And he noticed that all these billboards were sprouting up by the side of the road and obstructing his view of these beautiful vistas. And so he came up with the idea for signs and how, especially in that hippie era, signs were telling you
Yeah.
what you could do and what you couldn't do. And it was
Yeah.
really lightning in a bottle. And it just was the right song at the right time. And as I mentioned, it became the number one song in North America in the summer of 1972, sold millions of copies, was played over 1 million times on the radio, and gave Les royalty checks up until his passing. It was that
Yeah,
successful.
it's true. I
That was a
remember
great
Les
story.
telling that he could live off those royalty checks if he wanted. He could have just enjoyed it.
Mm.
Other people covered it. I understand there's a third book coming, but where can people pick up books 1 and 2,
Wow.
Jim?
Books 1 and 2 are available at Compact Music on Bank Street, at Odds and Sods on Maryvale, the Record Center on Wellington, Perfect Books on Elgin, Books on Beechwood. If you're in Almont, drop by Mill Street Books, a cool place. Chapters locations in Canada, Innis Road, and Ogilvy Road.
Excellent.
And if you can't
Jim,
get
I
out,
hate to cut
there's
you
always
off, but
Amazon.
I've run out of time. I'll encourage people to visit Jim's website. We'll be back with more after this.